Oh, hello out there, and welcome to the Sunday streaming edition of Adam's Mute Box, where today it's a sad day again because we're remembering a very prolific artist who died just yesterday. And before we get into that, I actually want to comment on this theme of memorialization because it's something that, the king of all YouTube music streamers mentioned just the other day. Of course, King Rick, Richard the First, King Rick Beato. And he said, he used to do live streams whenever a great musician died. And I remember those well. I remember watching the one, for instance, when Eddie Van Halen's death shocked me and shocked the world. And he said that some people loved them, but some said, oh, this is kind of grim. It's like a death stream. But I disagree with those members of his audience, and I wish he would do them again. He did a tribute to Ozzy Osbourne, a very interesting one. He played Into the Void on his guitar, of course, perfectly, because that's what Rick Beato does. And I think it's important because while it's more important to remember musicians in their lifetime, and it's also important to remember the music both that's cherished and maybe that's forgotten from musicians that have departed a long, long time ago. The best way to remember a musician is to celebrate their music and remember their contribution to music. I think we kind of owe it to great musicians, especially because there's no telling whether maybe 50, 60 years from now, the young people who are doing things now, if they will have the kind of longevity that the people who came out in the golden age of the music industry have had, because again, the industry's changed. Music has been there before the industry. Music has been there before music was professionalized in the 19th century in terms of the European and wider so-called Western tradition. Music's always been there. Music's been there the first time that a caveman decided to sing or bang on something rhythmically and express creativity that way. So that's not going away. Even if we have to go back to the caves, if we nuke each other to death, assuming they're real. There's a song about that. Then there'll always be music. But whether there's going to be a music industry, we already know that in our lifetimes, certainly between 1999 and the present day, the music industry's model that was largely unchanged since the first half of the 20th century, it's completely gone for the most part. And what is there is very, very different. Namely, the record labels are now subservient to the technology companies. So Spotify, Apple, Amazon, they have much, TikTok, YouTube, all the others, they have much more, Instagram, I could name them all. They have much more say over the way that music is commercialized than than that which the remaining couple of record companies have. Totally different story in the middle of the 20th century when there were many more labels than there were technology companies. It would be like saying that Ampex, who made tape machines, or JBL that made speakers, had influence over, what Elektra and Atlantic and all of the different labels were doing. And that just wasn't the case. But today, it's really the technology that does that. And Steve Jobs articulated it himself when he was introducing iTunes to the music industry as the only commercially viable alternative to the LimeWires and the Kazars, which followed on where Napster left off. He said, look, either you change your business model and make the music cheaper, $1 per song, and you don't need to buy an album. You can buy one song or two rather than the whole album, as many as you want. Then the industry is going to totally go away. And it was at that moment in the early 2000s that the tech industry became the dominant industrial force in the music industry. So I think that's my way of saying I think it's important to remember people from that very interesting era of the music industry. And today we're remembering Randy Meisner, who's one of the most important musicians in a hugely popular and important genre that we now know as country rock, because Randy Meisner was the co-founding member of what I would say are the two most important bands in that country rock world. First, Poco, and he indeed didn't spend much time with them initially. He came back later, but he does appear on their first album. But then he co-founded the most successful country rock band of all time, and this of course was the Eagles. And he was a member of the Eagles on all of their original run of albums, except for one, the final one, the long run, which, and that album, well, it's a good album. The country aspects of the country rock were almost gone by then. I mean, when you listen to the early Eagles albums and compare them to the long run, it's like, is this the same band? I mean, it's many of the same guys, not all of them, as we know. But the early Eagle albums were really, really country rock. Now, what do we mean really by country rock? Because one could make an argument that early rock and roll was a kind of fusion of the existing R&B music of the day along with the existing country and western music of the day. And then we can get into discussions about the difference between country music and rhythm and blues music, which have similar geographical origins. Both country music and R&B music can trace their origins to the music of the South, a region of the U.S. which I said, and I've said before, I've done a video on it, disproportionately influenced the sound of modern pop music. So much music either came directly from the South or came from migrations west by white musicians or migrations north to places like New York and Chicago by black musicians. And that's why to some degree country and R&B music, it's more of a socio-racial distinction than an artistic distinction, although of course there are audible differences. Swamp Dogg, one of my favorite soul singers of the 70s, who's done both straight music, political music, and parody music, he said that when he was growing up, the only radio station that he could really get was a country station. And he said that this was soul music. This was rhythm and blues music. You just need to, slow it down and have more of a groove behind it. And voila, there you go. And yeah, I get that it's a bit more nuanced than that, but there's a lot of truth in what he was saying. And the point he was saying is that he could sing these country songs, and if you just add a groove to it, it can become an R&B song that an R&B soul singer can sing. So then we get to country rock, because country has always influenced elements of rock, just as soul and R&B have influenced elements of rock. And when it comes to the 1970s, there's something interesting too. The difference between country, strict Nashville country music, and rock music was, again, more sociological in many ways than musically stylistic. And here was sort of the checklist that you would have. If they record in Nashville and are signed to a Nashville record label, it's country. If they're recording in LA and signed to what they would call the major labels, that would be rock. And then there was sort of the youth and age thing. If it was, if the person listening to it was 17 years old and smoking a spliff, okay, it's rock. If the person was 39 years old and drinking a beer, okay, then it's country. It sounds kind of silly and stupid, and it is, but this is kind of the reality of what it was. Now, that's not to say that a lot of country musicians didn't cross over. Glenn Campbell, one of my favorite musicians of all time, one of the finest guitarists of all time, I put him up there with John McLaughlin, Eddie Van Halen, some of the best ever. He was someone who started out in country, then session work, and then his country flavored music became pop hits that people from all genres listen to. And that really is a modern definition of pop music. It's, general population, which I know is a prison term, but there you go. Um, so the country rock in the 70s was people from a rock and roll lifestyle who listened to hard rock and couldn't get it out of their system, but they loved the arrangements, they loved the lyrical themes, and they loved the musical motifs of country music. And hence you get country rock. And the Eagles, with Randy Meisner as a co-founding and very important member, they helped to shape that sound. Now, unlike some of the members of the Eagles who are very vocal about, censoring YouTube, Tom Henley, Randy was always a very gentle soul. He was a Nebraska native. He grew up on a farm, and he always had that sort of classic Midwestern polite attitude throughout his life. But he was an incredibly accomplished bass player. He co-wrote a lot of great Eagles songs, and I frankly wish that he sung more Eagles songs, because "Take It to the Limit," which he sung, is one of the very best Eagles songs ever, and it's from one of the very best Eagles albums ever, and that's One of These Nights. It was an album that was released when they were getting really big, but before the fame sort of went to their heads, which it did after Hotel California, on of which Randy Meisner plays. But it was after that album that he left the band. But as I said, when you're talking about the original Eagles albums, there was only one of them that Randy wasn't on. Now, Randy actually had a very successful solo career. He only released around three, four, if you're counting one of the later things, solo albums, but they all sold respectably. They didn't sell huge, but they were really good albums. And his second solo album, which was called One More Song, had a great hit on it. And there's even a video of him performing it on the Midnight Special, probably the best music show this side of Radio Bremen's Beat Club. And the drummer who's performing with him looks very much like Jim Capaldi, but I haven't verified that, but it looks very much like the great Jim Capaldi. And yeah, it's another great song. And in his solo work, you get to hear his guitar playing, you get to hear his vocal work, which, as I said, I wish he sung lead vocal on more Eagles songs, because "Take It to the Limit" is not just one of the finest Eagles songs, but it's really one of the finest songs ever. It's just one of those songs that's cinematic. You could just see it. It's like a driving song where, people are thinking about life, thinking about love, thinking about loss. And there's a lot of those kinds of themes in Eagles songs. But Randy Meisner, for, my 2 cents, he did one of the very best ones of all. Now, I don't know if the guys in the band, particularly when the Eagles started to become a Don Henley dictatorship, I don't know if he was treated well, because there was, of course, the reunion for Hell Freezes Over in 1994, their big unplugged reunion with you. Oh, yeah. And again, that era was big for reunions, because the guys who were big in the 60s and 70s still had all of their physical and mental faculties by then. I mean, we're further away from the 90s now than the early 90s were from the mid 60s. That mind blowing man, says Timothy Leary. Um, and I think that was a bit unfair. It was basically uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Um, it was a reprisal of the lineup from the final Eagles album, The Long Run, where I think that it could have been a more sort of wholesale reunion, because they had plenty of session musicians on stage by then backing them up. So why not invite an original co-founding member, someone who was there even before Don Felder, who was part of Hell Freezes Over, but was then himself unceremoniously dismissed in 2001. So I think that was a bit of an injustice, even though Glenn Fry and Don Henley sung on a number of Randy Meisner's solo albums. And it really is interesting that while the Eagles still are played all of the time, two of the co-founding members are gone. Glenn Fry is gone. Now Randy Meisner is gone, and so it really is. We're getting to that era where the great musicians of this golden era of the music industry, where the music was, I would say, objectively good. And I'm not the old man looking at the clouds. I've actually done videos on why that era was unique. It was this unique juncture where the music was high quality, but there was still the industry side, the industrial muscle to really get it to the masses. And again, I don't like gatekeeping. One of the best things about this era is that gatekeeping is pretty much gone. But for that and for other sociological reasons, it probably means that there'll never be people who are as universally known, let alone as universally loved, as bands like the Eagles, who were one of the biggest bands of all time, certainly one of the biggest bands of the 70s. And people can blame social media. I really don't. I think it has to do with the fact that while music is always part of people's lives, In various eras, it takes center stage in people's lives, and in various eras, it doesn't. Take European classical music. In the 16th, 17th, and even much of the 18th century, the classical music of the great European tradition was either liturgical in its origins, or it was music played in the aristocratic chambers, hence chamber music. And the music, much as you could imagine it being at a party today, it was. I wouldn't call it exactly background music, but it wasn't the main attraction. The lord or lady of the manor showing off was the main attraction, kind of like a ditty party. But they didn't, have hidden cameras and Ghislaine Maxwell back then, or did they? Well, they did. They were just secret police and other people we can't really go into. But music in the 19th century did become the main attraction, and it was the era when European classical music became professionalized, meaning members of orchestras who were full time pros in one orchestra that was well funded, well rehearsed, with maestros who were incredibly talented. Wagner being primarily responsible for that ultra professionalization. And it was also the era when sheet music became a huge selling item. Companies made lots of money selling sheet music. By the end of the century, you had player pianos, player organs, both of which were very popular, and recorded sound, which was pretty bad technically in the late 19th century, but it got better and got better relatively quickly. And this is when pop music was born. It was, you took the elements of folk music, music played in a song form, usually by amateur musicians at a local level, and it professionalized the genre, just as around 100 years, less than 100 years earlier, really, classical music was professionalized. And the other thing it did is it took these folkish traditions and it made them national or international in nature rather than local or at best regional. And the industry grew and grew and grew. And one could make the argument that in the 60s, let's say 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, this was, in terms of financial industrial muscle, the top of this genre. And it's no coincidence that a lot of the bands and a lot of the solo artists that came out of that era have so much staying power, the Eagles being one of them. And again, that's a reason I think that we should celebrate the music and lives of and memorialize the lives of musicians of that era that are being lost. Because while this generation didn't live in the golden age of European classical music, the 19th century, or the early decades of pop music, let's say the 1880s through the 1920s, we didn't live through the sort of big band era of the 30s and 40s. A lot of us listening to this will have, in one way, either as children or as young adults, probably lived through the 60s, 70s, 80s, or 90s, all of which in their own way were golden ages of the music industry, when they had the financial and industrial muscle to promote musicians, some of whom were bad, but many of whom, when you look back on it, were really, really accomplished musicians, the Eagles being one such group. So we should absolutely pay tribute to people like Randy Meisner, a really fine musician, understated, but there would be no Eagles without him. Just because he wasn't one of the more shouty members of the band, it would not be what it was without him. And he had his hand, as I said, in co-founding the two most important bands of that country rock genre, Poco and the Eagles. And that's something that not a lot of others, not any others, can really say. So rest in peace, Randy Meisner, a great musician who helped give us a great genre. As always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.